I grew up knowing that love wasn't something I could expect at home. My parents, Linda and Richard, were successful businesspeople, but that's all they ever wanted to be. The idea of having a child seemed like an afterthought, or maybe even an inconvenience. They had me because it was the next step after marriage, the kind of thing people in their circle did. But I was never more than an item checked off their to-do list. For as long as I can remember, I've been surrounded by silence. Linda and Richard were always too busy for conversations that weren't about work or their next big venture. Our house was huge, with sprawling hallways and rooms that echoed. But it never felt like home. They worked late hours, traveled constantly, and hired nannies when I was young. By the time I was 6, they decided I could fend for myself as long as the fridge was stocked and the TV had plenty of channels. The housekeeper was there to clean, not to raise me. Birthdays were a particularly sharp reminder of how little I mattered. They would leave a card or some cash on the kitchen counter for the housekeeper to buy me a generic gift like a watch or bracelet. There was no cake, no candles, no friends invited over. Once, when I was 8, I tried to throw a little celebration for myself. I made peanut butter sandwiches, arranged them on a plate, and sat waiting at the dining table. They never showed. It was just me and the sandwiches, which I couldn't bring myself to eat. That evening, they came home late, tired and irritable, and didn't even notice my sad attempt at a party. Holidays weren't any better. Christmas was about expensive gifts, things they assumed I wanted because they saw them in advertisements. But it was all so impersonal. No one ever asked what I liked or what I cared about. The gifts were just a way to check a box, to say they'd done their part as parents. I'd open the shiny boxes alone in the morning while they slept off the exhaustion of their endless work schedule. Then they'd leave for a holiday trip without me because, as they put it, you'll be bored with adults around. The worst part was that I believed it was normal. For a long time, I thought all families were like this. It wasn't until I was 13 that the truth hit me like a brick. One of my classmates, Olivia, invited me over for her birthday. Her family was nothing like mine. Her parents decorated the house with balloons, baked a cake, and sang her a horribly off-key rendition of Happy Birthday. I remember watching Olivia's mom kiss her on the forehead and tell her how much she loved her. It felt like I was seeing a different world, one where kids mattered to their parents. I went home that night and cried. It wasn't fair. Why couldn't my parents care about me the way hers did? That was the moment I realized I wasn't a cherished daughter. I was an obligation. And even that felt like too much for them. By 16, I wanted to earn some independence. I thought maybe if I worked at their business, they'd finally see me as part of their world. I could help prove my worth, and maybe, just maybe, they'd look at me differently. I mustered the courage to ask. The answer came swiftly and coldly. "This isn't the place for you," my father said, barely glancing up from his laptop. "Focus on your studies. We'll take care of the rest." It wasn't about my grades or my capabilities. It was about keeping me at arm's length. They didn't want me involved in their lives. I wasn't even allowed to get a part-time job elsewhere because they didn't want me wasting time. My days were spent in the same suffocating house, staring out the window and wondering if this was all life had to offer. By the time I turned 18, I stopped hoping for change. My parents weren't going to magically care. I'd tried everything to bridge the gap, but their walls were impenetrable. All I could do was wait for my chance to leave and build a life that looked nothing like theirs. But even then, part of me clung to the hope that someday they'd see me, really see me, and regret the years they'd lost. Turning 18 should have been a milestone, but for me, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. That morning, Linda and Richard handed me an envelope, not with a card or money, but with an eviction notice. They told me it was time to fend for myself, as though I hadn't spent my whole life doing exactly that. I stared at the paper, struggling to process how my parents could so easily cut me off. But they had made up their minds, and there was no room for discussion. I packed what little I had, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, and throwing my few sentimental items into a box. There was no farewell dinner, no acknowledgement that they were sending their only child into the world with nothing but a few dollars I had saved from birthday gifts. They watched as I carried my things out the door, their faces blank, like I was a tenant whose lease had expired. The first few weeks were a blur of desperation. I found a room to rent, a dingy place with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet. It was all I could afford. My friend's dad, Brian, helped me move in and even gave me a loan to cover the deposit. He was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. But the relief was short-lived. I got a job as a receptionist at a small office, but my boss was vindictive, blaming me for every mistake, even ones I didn't make. After a month, she fired me over something trivial, leaving me without an income. The bills piled up quickly. Rent, utilities, groceries, it became impossible to keep up. I sold anything of value, including the bracelet my parents had given me for my 16th birthday. It wasn't much, but it bought me a few more days of food. When the landlord finally evicted me, I felt like I was back at square one. Only this time I had nowhere to go. Brian offered his backyard as a temporary solution, and I pitched a tent there, trying to convince myself it was only for a little while. Winter came fast that year. Nights were brutal, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing and blankets I had. I'd wake up shivering, my breath visible in the dim light of dawn. The loneliness was unbearable. Every time I heard laughter or saw the glow of lights from neighboring houses, it reminded me of what I'd never had. The people around me were living their lives, warm and safe inside their homes, while I was trying to survive another freezing night. One of Brian's neighbors, a kind woman named Susan, noticed me in the backyard one morning. She didn't ask questions, but I saw the concern in her eyes. A few days later, she approached me with a cup of tea and a proposition. She'd been in touch with someone who might be able to help. I was skeptical but desperate enough to listen. It turned out she had found my paternal grandparents, James and Margaret, who I hadn't seen since I was a toddler. Linda and Richard had cut them out of my life, citing some vague family dispute. The first phone call with James was surreal. He sounded shocked to hear about my situation and horrified by my parents' actions. Within days, they had arranged for me to come live with them. James and Margaret sent me the money for a plane ticket, urging me to come as soon as possible. I held the ticket in my frozen hands as I waited at the airport, feeling a mix of fear and relief. Susan hugged me tightly before I left, whispering that things would get better. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. When the plane landed, James and Margaret were already waiting for me at the airport. They looked older than I remembered, but their faces lit up when they saw me. Margaret pulled me into a hug so tight I thought I'd break, but I didn't mind. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone truly cared. Tears streamed down my face as we walked to their car. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time it felt like I might actually have one. Moving in with James and Margaret felt like stepping into a different world. Their home wasn't fancy, but it radiated warmth. For the first time, I experienced what it meant to have people who genuinely cared about me. They treated me as their own, not out of obligation, but out of love. James always had a kind word, and Margaret made sure I never went to bed hungry. Their affection filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep. Over time, I began to rebuild my life. They encouraged me to go back to school, and with their support, I enrolled in a local college. Studying felt like a new beginning, a chance to prove to myself that I was more than the neglect I had endured. Margaret's home-cooked meals became my fuel, and James's stories about his own struggles gave me the motivation to keep going. When I walked across the stage to receive my degree, their cheers were the loudest in the crowd. It was a moment I'll never forget. With my education behind me, I secured a job that allowed me to stand on my own 2 feet. I started saving diligently, not just for myself but also for James and Margaret. They had done so much for me, and I wanted to give something back. When they mentioned their dream of retiring to a warmer climate, I saw an opportunity. I offered to buy their house at a price that would give them the financial freedom to live comfortably. At first, they hesitated, but I convinced them it was the least I could do. Handing over the keys to their new home was one of the proudest moments of my life. Life seemed stable for the first time ever. The house that had been their sanctuary became mine, filled with memories of their kindness and my own growing accomplishments. Yet, no matter how much I achieved, the shadow of Linda and Richard lingered. I'd lie awake at night, wondering if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted their actions. It was a wound that refused to heal, no matter how much love James and Margaret gave me. Then everything changed. I had just returned from a work trip, exhausted but looking forward to the comfort of my own bed. As I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The lights were on, and there were unfamiliar cars parked outside. My heart raced as I unlocked the front door. Inside, I found Linda and Richard sitting in the living room, acting as if they belonged there. My childhood memories of their indifference flashed before me, mixing with a new wave of anger. They greeted me with a smugness that made my blood boil. They claimed the house was theirs by family rights, as if they had any claim to the life I had built. Their justification was as hollow as their parenting had been. The audacity left me stunned. I stood there, gripping my suitcase, trying to process how the same people who had thrown me out without a second thought now felt entitled to my home. The situation escalated quickly. They had moved in while I was away, bringing their belongings and making themselves comfortable. It was clear they had no intention of leaving willingly. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. This wasn't just about the house. It was about the years of neglect, the abandonment, and now, the intrusion into the sanctuary I had created for myself. I knew I had to act, but I wasn't sure how. James and Margaret had taught me to stand up for myself, but confronting Linda and Richard brought back all the old fears and insecurities. They had taken so much from me already. The thought of them taking over my home was unbearable. I needed a plan, but at that moment, all I felt was rage and disbelief. The days that followed Linda and Richard's intrusion were some of the most surreal of my life. They had no intention of leaving, and their brazenness left me stunned. At first, I thought confronting them head-on might work, but every attempt to reason with them only fueled their entitlement. They acted as if they had every right to stay, twisting the narrative to suit their delusions. What shocked me most was their calm confidence, as though they had planned this for months. After I filed a lawsuit to evict them, they began spinning lies in court. They told the authorities that they had a verbal lease agreement with me, fabricating a story about how I had invited them to stay temporarily. To back up their claims, they produced fake documents and a set of duplicate keys they had secretly made without my knowledge. It was a level of deceit I hadn't thought them capable of, and it left me reeling. Their manipulation didn't stop there. They started paying a token amount for utilities, using it as proof of their fabricated arrangement. It wasn't enough to cover the actual costs, but it was just enough to make their lies harder to disprove. Meanwhile, they made themselves at home in the most obnoxious ways possible. They moved into the master bedroom, claiming it was more suitable for them because of their age and status. They left their belongings scattered everywhere, making it clear they considered the house theirs. I felt trapped in my own home. Every day was a battle to hold onto the life I'd built, and every night I went to bed seething with frustration. Their presence was suffocating. They mocked me openly, belittling my efforts to reclaim my space and insinuating that I was ungrateful for everything they had done for me. The irony was almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. As much as I wanted to storm into the master bedroom and throw them out, I knew the law didn't work that way. Eviction wasn't a simple matter, especially with the fake documents they'd conjured up. I had to go through the proper channels no matter how long it took or how much it drained me. So, I hired a lawyer and began the arduous process of proving the truth. The legal battle consumed my life. I spent hours gathering evidence, combing through every detail that could discredit their lies. My lawyer warned me that cases like these often dragged on, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. Every day they stayed felt like a personal attack, a reminder of how little they cared about the pain they caused. But amidst the chaos, I found strength in James and Margaret. Their unwavering support was my anchor. They reminded me that I owed Linda and Richard nothing, and that standing up for myself was the right thing to do. The tension escalated as the court date approached. Linda and Richard doubled down on their schemes, attempting to sway neighbors and even reaching out to mutual acquaintances to spread their version of events. They painted me as the ungrateful daughter who had turned on her parents, conveniently omitting their years of neglect and abandonment. It was exhausting, but I refused to let their lies break me. One evening, I discovered that they had tampered with some of my belongings, likely in an attempt to make it look like they had lived in the house longer than they actually had. It was a petty and desperate move, but it only strengthened my resolve. I documented everything, taking photos and keeping detailed records. Every piece of evidence felt like a small victory in a war that seemed endless. The closer we got to the court date, the more erratic their behavior became. They started making veiled threats, hinting that they might damage the house or its contents if I didn't cooperate. But I knew giving in wasn't an option. I'd come too far to let them take away what I'd worked so hard to build. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of my independence, my escape from their toxic control. When the day finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom with my head held high. I knew the fight wasn't over yet, but I also knew I wasn't alone. James and Margaret sat in the front row, their presence a reminder of the family I had chosen, the one that truly cared for me. No matter what happened, I was determined to see this through, to reclaim what was mine, and to finally close the chapter on Linda and Richard's manipulations. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the judge handed down the ruling. The verdict was in my favor. Linda and Richard were given 30 days to vacate the house. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Justice, though long and exhausting, had prevailed. Yet, the battle wasn't entirely over. Their reaction to the ruling was predictable, a mixture of outrage and self-pity. They acted as if they were the victims, immediately launching into desperate attempts to guilt me into letting them stay. Over the next few weeks, they bombarded me with pleas, veiled threats, and manipulative arguments. They painted a picture of destitution and begged me to reconsider, but their words held no weight. Their pattern of entitlement and deceit had hardened me against their tactics. I refused to back down. Every time they tried to corner me, I stood firm, knowing that giving in would only prolong the misery. As the eviction day loomed, their desperation turned into a strange calmness. It unnerved me, but I refused to engage with their mind games. I focused on what mattered, securing my home and my peace. The locks had already been scheduled to change the moment they left, and I had taken precautions to ensure that they couldn't pull any last-minute stunts. The day finally arrived. I stood at a distance as they loaded their remaining belongings into a van. The sight was surreal, a culmination of months of tension and struggle. They avoided eye contact, but I could feel their resentment radiating toward me. As the van pulled out of the driveway, I took a deep breath. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a silence I welcomed. Once the van disappeared from sight, I changed the locks immediately. It was a symbolic act as much as a practical one. With each turn of the key, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in months, the house truly felt like mine again. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a lingering sense of unease. The ordeal had left scars, ones that would take time to heal. That evening, I sat down with James and Margaret to share a quiet dinner. It was then that they dropped a bombshell. In the midst of our conversation, they mentioned Helen, my maternal grandmother. I had always known she was a wealthy woman, but what I didn't know was that she had left a sizable inheritance to Linda and Richard. According to James, that money had been the foundation for their so-called success. The revelation hit me like a freight train. It was infuriating to learn that they had used Helen's legacy to rebuild their lives while treating me like an afterthought. The irony was bitter. They had squandered a gift meant to provide security for our family and had left me to fend for myself. It raised so many questions about the choices they had made, but it also brought a sense of closure. Their success had never been about hard work or sacrifice. It had been built on someone else's generosity. That night, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, it had all been rooted in their inability to see beyond their own needs. But I realized something important. Their actions didn't define me. I had fought for my independence, my dignity, and my future. And I had won. The house, now quiet and empty, felt like a blank slate. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a testament to my resilience. I had faced the worst and come out stronger. As I walked through each room, I made a silent promise to myself. This would be a new beginning, free from their shadows. It was time to reclaim not just my home, but my life. In the weeks that followed the eviction, the house became quieter than I ever thought possible. The chaos and toxicity Linda and Richard brought had left, but so had the memories of my grandparents' warmth and support. As much as I had fought to reclaim the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to let it go. It had served its purpose, but holding on to it felt like clinging to the past. I needed a fresh start, a clean slate far from the shadows of my parents. The decision to sell wasn't easy. The house held so much history, both good and bad, but I knew in my heart that moving on was the right thing to do. I reached out to a realtor and began the process of listing it. Walking through each room one last time, I felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. This house had been my sanctuary and my battleground, but now it would be someone else's home. I hoped they would fill it with love and laughter, the kind I had found so briefly with James and Margaret. As the sale finalized, I started planning my next steps. I wanted to go somewhere new, a place where I could build a life entirely my own. The thought of starting over was daunting, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my destiny. I vowed to carry the lessons I'd learned with me, especially the promise to break the cycle of neglect and entitlement that had plagued my family. If I ever had children, I would give them the love and stability I had so desperately craved. Just as I was beginning to settle into the idea of my future, I received a surprising phone call from a distant relative. They had heard about everything that had happened with Linda and Richard and wanted to share something they thought I should know. It turned out that my parents' business success had a darker side. Over the years, they had engaged in unethical practices, cutting corners, and exploiting others to build their wealth. The news didn't shock me as much as it should have. It felt like confirmation of what I'd always suspected. Their success was as hollow as their love. Hearing about their questionable dealings gave me a strange sense of closure. For so long, I had compared my struggles to their apparent prosperity, wondering why life had been so unfair. But now I realized that their success was built on shaky ground. The same selfishness and disregard for others that had defined their parenting had seeped into every part of their lives. It was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I didn't need to see their downfall to feel vindicated. Knowing it was inevitable was enough. With the house sold and my plans set, I packed my belongings and said goodbye to the town that had been both my prison and my refuge. As I drove away, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I wasn't running from my past. I was moving toward a future that I could shape on my terms. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream about what that future might look like: a small house filled with warmth, a job that gave me purpose, and maybe even a family of my own someday. Looking back, I realized how much I had grown. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I wasn't the scared, neglected child Linda and Richard had left behind. I was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to create a life worth living. Their toxicity no longer had power over me. I had broken free. As I crossed the state line, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. In that moment, I knew I had already won. The cycle of neglect and manipulation ended with me. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them with the resilience I had earned through every battle. My story was no longer about Linda and Richard. It was about me, and I was finally ready to embrace it.